Hello, friends, and welcome back to Stories About Entitled People. Sounds like you had quite the bizarre and frustrating experience with unexpected visitors, OP. The entitlement of some people can be baffling. But before we begin, best way to support our channel is to leave comments, like, and subscribe with the turned-on bell so you don't miss the new video every single day. Here we go. I work here, but not for you. I'm a Dutch artist. At one point, I had a studio in an otherwise empty building in a primarily residential area. It was an anti-squat arrangement, cheap, but the building was in crap condition with leaks and mold. Our studio was in the least crappy part of the building, and the owner did F all to improve conditions. Nonetheless, there was a for rent/sale sign on the front, and the anti-squat company had posters in the window with their contact info on it. Our studio had only 2 windows that could be opened, and I had to open the door for ventilation when I used fixative or varnish on large drawings so the fumes wouldn't kill me. One midweek afternoon, I'm waiting for a layer of varnish to dry, and I'm talking to my husband in the office when we hear loud banging coming from the entrance, a woman shouting, kids yelping. Confused, we went over to see a woman carrying a clunky plastic kid scooter that she's banging into the door frame, the doors, the walls, into a table that had a security camera on it, almost toppling it. Keep in mind, my hands and face are smudged with charcoal. I had a tight deadline to finish something, so I looked generally disheveled and scruffy. Excuse me, I try to interrupt the screaming of this woman arguing with her kid who wants his scooter back, even as his sister rides hers into our studio and starts crashing into stuff. What are you doing here? We block the hallway to keep her daughter from entering any further, to where we keep the chemicals and the sharp things and the expensive fragile things. Eventually, she looks up. I want to rent here, she demands at the top of her lungs. You can't rent this place. This place is rented out to us. We're the renters. If you want a different space in the building, call the number on the poster in the window, which you could see from the outside. Mind, this was a mostly empty hallway except for the table and camera. There were no signs or anything up advertising our studio because we didn't need to advertise it. I want to rent this. How do I rent this? She shouts more angrily. At first I thought maybe she didn't understand because Dutch wasn't her first language, but she didn't have a noteworthy accent. She's still arguing with her kid, however, and swinging the scooter about as she swivels. You have to call the number on the poster out front. I point in its direction, hoping she'd get it and leave. In vain. How do I rent? What does it cost? She urges. It took us several minutes before we could get her to leave, repeatedly telling her, this is private, we're renters, you're trespassing and you need to leave, call the number. All the while having to keep her daughter from going through the pockets of the coats we have in the hallway wardrobe. But finally she did, understanding she had to call the number on the poster if she wanted to rent, and ambled off, screaming at her kids and banging the plastic scooter into everything as she went. Sadly, she wasn't the only person who thought they could just walk in and demand to know our business, but after this encounter we started blocking the door with a wooden pallet covered in bells to deter, or at least tip us off to, casual invasions. And we still caught people leaning in to gawk or even fumbling at the pallet to gain entrance, demanding service when we approached them and told them they couldn't come in. I never found out what kind of service they expected. Who sees a building with no signs, no posters, no advertisements, and thinks they can just wander in to demand stuff? It's unfortunate that you had to deal with such incidents, but your response to safeguard your studio is commendable. It's a good reminder that privacy and personal space should be respected, even in shared or public spaces. And our second story. Paranoid and abusive customer swallows his own medicine. I used to work as a junior admin for a medium-sized web hosting company. The actual job title went a little bit different, but junior admin is essentially what the work amounted to. The team I work for is a sort of white gloves, premium managed hosting service with a fairly steep monthly cost, intended to provide hosting support to mostly medium businesses that were paying for fairly high-powered VPS or dedicated servers, or Serval. On my first day on the team, I had my first interaction with one of our regular callers we'll just call Dan. Dan is extremely paranoid about his server security, and virtually everything running on his server is completely customized with third-party software we don't provide support for. I later found out that everyone else on the team intentionally avoided picking up Dan's chats, and letting me walk into that interaction with Dan blindly was sort of a welcome to the team hazing ritual. When you initiate a support contact, be it via support ticket, chat, or phone, you have to provide either a password, pre-generated access hash, or passphrase set up by the account owner before providing support and disclosing potentially sensitive customer information. Any one of these three methods would serve to verify account ownership and allow full access to the account, including making additional purchases, canceling services, and pretty much anything else. This was not secure enough for Dan. Dan insisted that before any support is rendered, two of these methods had to be provided. As company policy only calls for one, Dan's preferences were simply annotated as a sticky note on the account, which is easy to miss. In my first interaction with Dan, he voluntarily provided only one of the verification methods, and after verifying it checks out, I began addressing his support issue. Dan flies off the handle and loses his crap because I didn't prompt him for a second verification method, and launches into a really long and drawn-out lecture on keeping his account secure. He eventually calmed down enough to let me do my job and provide him with support. Fast forward a few months, and more than a few additional interactions with Dan, raising support tickets for asinine questions like, who owns this IP address that shows as having been blocked in my firewall logs? I demand a full security sweep of my server to make sure it wasn't compromised. I see that Dan shows up as waiting in the chat queue and groan to myself. The only other admin that worked that night was on lunch, and I was scheduled to go on lunch right as he gets back. Not only is interacting with Dan a complete nightmare, he also takes forever to get to the point, and it looked like lunch wasn't going to happen anytime soon. I accept the chat, the user provides the first verification method, and dutifully I ask for a second verification method, not about to be yelled at a second time by Dan. The second verification method checks out too. I ask how I can help, and the person on the other end goes, "This isn't Dan, I'm his developer. Dan hasn't paid me for my work, so I want you to delete everything on the server." Working in this industry, I've come in contact with more than a few attempts of social engineering and was completely taken aback by this guy's candor. He clearly knew our company policies and knew that as long as the caller was able to verify the account and provide the necessary credentials, we'd be forced to comply with their request. I quickly performed an external backup of all of Dan's files. The person on chat did not ask me to delete backups, nor did he ask me not to take any, and deleted all of the site files, effectively taking down Dan's website. I will admit that this felt extremely satisfying, and taking a backup of Dan's stuff was a courtesy that I didn't have to perform, given the circumstances, but knew my life would not be made easier if I hadn't done so. 20 minutes go by, and I'm keeping my eye on the queue, entirely forgetting about lunch at this point. I knew Dan would call any minute now, and that I wouldn't be able to dodge his calls at this point. Sure enough, Dan's call, no chat this time, comes in. From the moment I pick up the phone, Dan's screaming in my ear about getting hacked and how insecure our infrastructure was. It takes another 10 minutes for him to calm down enough to provide both methods of verification. Before verification, I was not able to provide any account information as per policy. Once he was verified, he demanded to know what happened to his website, and with a calm I didn't really feel, I told him, "That was me. I deleted your site, Dan. Your developer started a chat and was able to provide both of the verification methods on your account, confirming account ownership. As per policy, this provides him with full access rights, and we're obligated to comply with the requests. This is not the kind of access a security-minded individual such as yourself should have given out to a developer you stiffed on his bill." I told him that I slightly bent the rules for him and took a completely random courtesy backup of his files right before the request to delete the site files came in. A few minutes later, I've got Dan's site back up and running. No idea if he ever ended up paying his developer, but we changed his access credentials and passphrase at the end of the call, and Dan became a lot easier to work with from that day forth. Well done, OP. You even covered your butt so there was no blowback for complying with what you knew was a malicious request. And it sounds like Dangerous Dan might have learned a small lesson. And our last story. Neighbors using my paid parking spot. I rent an apartment, and an assigned exterior parking space within my complex's parking lot is included in my rent. I have a parking pass that I display in my car and documentation from my landlord stating that this specific spot belongs to me. I have a neighbor that always parks in my spot. I've contacted my landlord every time this happens, asking him to handle it, but nothing ever happens. I've also kept a log of every time I notice this neighbor in my spot and when I've contacted my landlord. For what it's worth, neighbor does not have a visible parking pass on his car and also puts a cone in my spot when he's gone to reserve it, so I don't think this is just confusion. I don't think he owns a spot at all. This past weekend, said neighbor had my car towed from my spot. I confronted him in person, but all he did was claim that the spot was his. I once again contacted my landlord, who stated that this spot was indeed mine. I shouldn't have been towed, and he would speak with my neighbor to reiterate that it's my spot. Well, apparently neighbor didn't listen, because last night he was in my spot again. I called a towing company, same one that towed me, to have him towed last night, but they either didn't come or were talked out of it by him, because when I woke up this morning, his car was still there. Additional info that might be relevant: my complex is managed by an HOA, and my landlord always claims he'll notify them when I make a complaint about my neighbor. I'm growing incredibly frustrated with this situation as I pay for this spot. Update edit. I just spoke with the HOA. They confirmed that the spot is mine and that this neighbor doesn't even have a parking spot at all. HOA also said he should have never been authorized to have my car towed and are speaking with the towing company to ensure it won't happen again. Finally, they provided me with a 24/7 emergency number that I can call to have my neighbor towed every time he's in my spot. It seems odd to me that one would be able to call for a tow without absolute proof of ownership of the property, beyond a copy of a lease agreement or proof that the vehicle is trespassing and not allowed. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.